ABSL Summit. Transform to thrive.
I'm going to talk about AI, and I hate sharing opinions. I don't think it makes much sense. So instead, I'd like to show you some examples, and I will let you be the judge. So here's an interesting example to consider. This is a sentence in English which says, the object did not fit the briefcase because it was too small. If you ask Google Translate to translate it into Polish, and Google Translate has some rudimentary AI, you get the following outcome. Przedmiot nie zmieścił się do teczki, ponieważ była za mała, which is roughly the same thing. Now I'm going to swap just a single word. The object did not fit the briefcase because it was too big. And Google Translate says, przedmiot nie zmieścił się do teczki, ponieważ była za duża. Which means essentially that the object did not fit the briefcase because the briefcase was too big. Here the problem is that the AI does not understand the context. In Polish, in English, the word it has no gender, so we don't know whether it refers to the object or the briefcase. And in order to translate it correctly, you need to provide this extra context. You have to understand the meaning of the sentence, and AI clearly sucks at this, cannot proceed correctly. So let's have a look at ChatGPT-4. What it is going to do with this example. How to understand the sentence, the object did not fit the briefcase because it was too big. The sentence is unambiguous. It refers to the object, which means that the object was too big to fit in the briefcase, blah, blah, blah. Now let's try the other one. How to understand the sentence, the object did not fit the briefcase because it was too small. I just changed a single word in the prompt, and I get a completely different output, which is already interesting. The sentence is slightly ambiguous and could be understood in two different ways depending on the context. In one understanding, it refers to the object, which means that the object was too small to fit the briefcase. This can sound unintuitive, but perhaps there are some elements of the briefcase that have to have minimum size in order to fit the object correctly or be saved, blah, blah, blah. In second understanding, it refers to the briefcase, which means the briefcase was too small to fit the object. This is more typical and an intuitive understanding of the sentence. Most often, the sentence means that the briefcase was too small to fit the object. So we almost got a philosophical treaty about this relation, but in order to produce this, you see there is a huge gap between abilities, cognitive abilities of simple Google Translate and what ChatGPT can provide. And clearly, the output is completely different, which means that, well, if you would to interpret this operationally, this indicates some level of understanding, whatever that means, of the content, not just grammatical structures. So let's have a look at what other problems, logical puzzles, ChatGPT can handle. So this is one example. When a year has 12 days. A logical puzzle. And, well, if you asked a person, I mean, you get different outputs. Anyone has any clue what the answer would be? I can't hear very well, but yeah, that's okay. So I guess some dates are being given. Well, here's the output. A year is 12 days long on the 12th of January. In fact, it's incorrect on the 13th of January, but let's keep this as a correct answer. But this is a typical riddle. I mean, perhaps it was present in the training data. We are never sure whether this is just repeated from the training data or it's really worked out by the model. So let's try something original. This is going to be a riddle that was not in the training data for a very simple reason that this is a riddle I came up with myself. It goes like this. What is the answer to this question? Jaka jest odpowiedź na to pytanie? And here's a very interesting story. When I first asked this to the model, the instant reply is that some information is lacking. This is clearly incomplete. Maybe I have to provide extra context. The model was unable to give me the answer, which is very interesting already, because from correct answers, I wouldn't be able to discriminate between repeating the answer from that training data and working it out by the model. Here, I know that model is unaware of the answer. It cannot give me the answer because, well, it can't. It says it needs extra data. So this is a good moment to test its cognitive abilities, because now I can give it a hint to see whether the hint will be sufficient to solve the problem. And this problem has a perfectly logical solution. So my hint in this case was that the word jaka, or what in English, has two different meanings, depending on the context. In one meaning, this could refer to the question, what is the answer to the question, but you could also understand it in a way that you ask, what are the properties of the answer? And that was sufficient for the model to produce the following output. The answer, single-worded, jednowyrazowa, to the question, what is the answer to the question, could be considered creative and satisfactory. Why is that? Because the answer, single-worded, is indeed single-worded. It correctly self-describes itself. Therefore, it answers the question, what is the answer to the question? So, you see, this is quite original and difficult problem, and most humans have problems solving it. And also, ChatGPT-4 couldn't handle it by itself. But a hint was sufficient to solve this problem satisfactorily, which means that not only this was not in the training data, because it's an original puzzle, but also model couldn't solve it by itself, which is another proof it was not in the training data, but the hint was sufficient to produce this. So operationally speaking, that would be a sign of some level of reasoning on a very basic level. This is another example of a logical puzzle. Grandfather and grandmother together are 126 years old. Grandfather is twice as old as grandmother was when he was as old as she is now. Right? How old is grandmother? When I tested this against my students, after third repetitions, they were able to write down sets of equations and solve them. ChatGPT does it in the first attempt, writes equations, solves them. The answer is correct, 54 years old. So, but what happened just a few months earlier when we had ChatGPT 3.5, this more primitive version that we can currently use for free? When I asked it, co to jest? Postawię pływa I kaczka się nazywa. What is it? It swims on a pond and it's called a duck. The reply was, this popular question or riddle has the answer, a header, głowica. A header is a mechanical part of the device that allows for a rotational movement between two elements of a machine. It can swim on a pond. It has been, if it was removed from the device and sunk in the water, complete nonsense, which shows that it's really nicely written in Polish, nice grammatical structures, well written, but no logic whatsoever. And you can see that there is a huge gap between these reasoning abilities of this early 3.5 version model and the contemporary GPT-4. So the interesting question is, what happened in between? What happened to the model so that it became so much better in solving these types of problems? And there is no clear answers to this because we don't know everything about the model. Actually, we don't very little because OpenAI isn't open anymore. But what we gathered unofficially is that the model was simply scaled up. The number of parameters was 10 times larger. The amount and quality of the data was improved. And that was it. By just scaling the model, it resulted in this huge jump in cognitive abilities from a model that generates complete nonsense and cannot reason at all to a model that solves some certain level of logical puzzles. So this particular specimen here is my son. One day he came from the kindergarten and he suddenly knew how to play chess. I don't know how to play chess, he taught me. Then he went to primary school and won the tournament in the whole school. But the riddle with grandfather and grandmother is way too difficult for him. He is unable to solve it. I tested. Because simply he cannot solve systems of equations. He does not have the tools, the mathematical tools. So this is interesting because we already have certain problems that can be solved using ChatGPT-4, but children at this age, roughly 8 years old, are unable to solve these problems. So I started to test these problems. I tested more than 100 logical puzzles, and I tried to find a single example of a puzzle that could be solved by a smart 8-year-old, but couldn't be solved by ChatGPT-4, and I couldn't find a single one. Quite contrary, there were many problems that GPT-4 could solve that children could not. So this already shows that at present we have AI systems that can reason on a very simple level, slightly better than children at this age, but the rate of development of those models is much faster than rate of development of children. This jump between version 3.5 and 4 took only a couple of months. So if we keep this rate for another couple of years, And this is what people in OpenAI assure us of, that Sam Altman said that we will keep that rate for at least 5 or 6 years. That means that this generation of humans that already lives with us will never solve a single logical problem that is too difficult for AI, if that rate is preserved. We don't know that, but if there is no ceiling, if there is nothing preventing that development, this is the reality we are living in. Quite interesting. This guy is Jan LeCun, chief scientist at Meta. He is one of the pioneers of deep learning. He is the discoverer of convolutional neural networks, recipient of the Turing Award, which is kind of a Nobel for IT guys. And in January 2022, before the release of ChatGPT 3.5, before this primitive version was released, he gave this very interesting interview in which he said the following thing. If I take this phone and put it on the table and push the table, and I ask you what happens to the phone, the answer will be obvious to you. The phone will move with the table. I think there is no such text that could convey this message to ChatGPT. Even ChatGPT 5000 will never answer this. 2 months later, ChatGPT 3 is released. I put the phone on the table, I push the table, what happened to the phone? Based on the information, I can guess what happened. Most probably, the phone was moved with the table unless you pushed it so hard that the phone fell on the ground. So you see, that's why I don't like to share opinions, because even the experts in this are clearly wrong, even 2 months in advance. They are unable to predict the future with very short notice. So for that reason, I'd rather stick to the facts and not pay much attention to opinions. But it was quite interesting that models can do things that surprise even their own creators. And I have tested what else those models can do instead of, apart from solving some simple logical puzzles. I asked myself, do these models know what is a shape of a letter? Shapes of characters. Do they know what is the shape of letter A, for example? The question is quite silly because obviously they learn on huge amounts of text. But if you think about it, they have never seen any text. They have seen a bunch of zeros and ones, just logical bits that have no shapes in them. So how would they know what is the shape of a character? And how could I test it? Well, fortunately, those models have learned how to use programming languages. In particular, they can draw things using graphic programming languages. And I asked ChatGPT to draw a letter A using LaTeX code. And then I compiled it. And this is the outcome. The code on the left is generated by ChatGPT 4. This is shape of a letter A. This is letter F. This is N. So somehow model knows shapes, and it has only learned on zeros and ones, on text. How is it possible? So when I asked a friend of mine, I showed this example to a friend of mine, he said, oh, most probably those models have seen drawings of letters in the training data, like here. In the 90s, we used to use these ASCII art drawings where we drew stuff with ASCII characters. Perhaps that was in the training data. Okay. But when I asked to draw a letter G, this is the outcome. And again, it's quite interesting to learn on mistakes. This is where we can learn something about the model. When we get the correct answer, we don't know whether it has been copied from the training data or not. Here, we can learn something. In this case, we learn that this wasn't copied. If it was just a copy, it would be as easy to copy G or A or any other character. This suggests that the model learned the shapes, not from copying the shapes from training data, but learning about the shapes from the description of characters in the text. And since letter G is more difficult to describe, the model simply failed to understand the description. That's it. So this is already quite impressive that the model is able to interpret the description and write it down in terms of this kind of drawings. In fact, people in Microsoft, before release of ChatGPT 4, tested that model for a long time, and they found amazing capabilities that were not planned for by the designers of the model. And they published a 150 pages long paper called Sparks of AGI, where they gave a lot of interesting examples what else those models can do. And in particular, they asked the model to make a drawing of a unicorn. And the unofficial version, released in 2023, it was tested for several months. And when asked this question for the first time, ChatGPT-3 did this. I don't know if you can see anything. Essentially, a few lines and few shapes, nothing very spectacular. But ChatGPT-4 did this. This is September, October, and November. Getting better. So you see there's also this huge gap between ChatGPT-3 and 4, which also correlates with the ability to logically reason. However, I also use this opportunity to test exactly the same prompts in the publicly available version that was released half a year later. And I was interested in how much better they are going to be. This is official version. This is April, May, June, July. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. And the question, why is that? Apparently, the reason for this is, again, guessing because we don't know for certain these things, but probably the reason is that the unofficial version was not equipped with any politically correct filters that prevent the model to say something that could be challenging our political correctness. But the official version is full of these filters that restrict it from speaking freely. And apparently the side effect of that is that the model is getting dumber. And also you see not only the drawings are worse, but also logical reasoning gets worse and worse, which has already been also observed. One question I was really puzzled about is to what degree those models copy the training data, to what degree they really generate it from scratch. And this is an example I tested very early before those models were released a couple of years ago. This is a black and white photograph of David Lynch holding a chicken. There's only one photograph like this available. I knew because I took this photo 18 years ago. And I was wondering if I asked the model to make a drawing of a black and white photograph of David Lynch holding a chicken, will I get something that his copies of these elements will copy this photo, or will it just produce it from scratch? This is the outcome. What is interesting here is that this photo has not been copied, and I don't see any elements of the photo to be used in the generated images. And I have tested countless examples to try to find a single example of the model copying training data of any sort, and I couldn't find a single example of that. Which suggests that the training data is used to create some model of reality, and then that model of reality is next used to generate the output from scratch. So it's not an idea that this is just a huge database where you use elements and copy and paste, simply is inconsistent with these tests. Now, the models are really capable. They can do many interesting stuff. This is a paper from Nature from a couple of months ago, where the company called DeepMind released a model that was able to solve mathematical problems. In this case, these problems were two-dimensional geometry problems on a level of International Math Olympiad, very high level, and the models were able to solve these problems in a logical fashion on a level better than average participant of the International Olympiad. In fact, the model was almost as good as a gold medalist in solving problems on that level. So the reasoning abilities are quite impressive already, and the most impressive part here is that there was zero training data provided by humans. So there was no database at all. How is it possible? Well, the model used synthetic data that it generated itself, a bunch of artificial problems that allowed the model to learn about relations between objects in mathematics, and that knowledge was sufficient to solve the problems on the level of International Olympiad, with zero training data. So the idea that those models are fundamentally limited by the quality and quantity of the data provided by humans is simply a superstition. That company has a long history of showing otherwise, that you have models that can do amazing stuff with zero training data. So the question is whether we are dealing with intelligence here or something else. What is it? Can we call it intelligence, or is it something just like mathematical operations that have nothing to do with intelligence? So the Wikipedia definition of intelligence involves a statement that this is an ability to perceive or infer information or adapt to changing environments, blah, blah, blah. To me, this definition is completely pointless. I mean, this doesn't make sense because it does not explain how my brain is adapting to environment, how exactly it gives me the ability to perceive and infer from information. What happens in my brain? This is just a result. What causes this? But there is a better definition of intelligence. It has to do with the so-called Hatter Award that is awarded to the best data compression algorithm. You get a gold medal like this, and 500,000 euros for the best compression data algorithm. This is awarded yearly for the past more than 12 years already. And you can see that on this curve, the algorithms that took part in the competition were better and better. So what does it have to do with intelligence? Well, if you ask yourself what do you have in a typical IQ test, you could have a question like this. A glove to a hand is like a sock to a foot. Or you could be asked to complete the sequence of images. Or you could be asked to complete a sequence of numbers. Different types of tests, but what they have in common, the common ability you have to have in order to solve these puzzles is the ability to observe patterns or to observe analogies, to be more precise. This is exactly what we are asking about. In the first case, we are asking about analogy between relation between glove and hand and sock and a foot. In the second example, you have to observe that the analogy exists between the first row and the second row. For the case of numbers, you have to observe that there is analogy between consecutive numbers and relations between them and apply that further. You have to be able to see analogies. This guy got famous, Isaac Newton, got famous for observing an analogy that nobody else could observe. An analogy between laws of physics governing falling apples and laws of physics governing stars and planets. Analogy nobody else could observe. A poet is a person who is able to construct metaphors, for example. A metaphor is nothing but an analogy between different ideas. So these different types of intelligence really deal with ability to observe analogies. And ability to observe analogies is exactly what you need to compress data, because if you have a long string of numbers, zeros and ones, if you can observe that this part of the string is the same with that part of the string, or there is some analogy, then instead of writing it twice, you can simply refer to the first example and save some space. So the compression rate is a measure of intelligence of those algorithms if you define intelligence as the ability to see analogies. And if you take that definition, you see that it has nothing to do with consciousness or emotions or anything like that. You can have completely unconscious compression data algorithm that has some level of intelligence because it observes some analogies. And conversely, you can have a conscious human that is not very intelligent. So you see, these things have nothing to do with each other. This is the rate of progress that we are dealing with currently. This is a plot that shows a number of parameters, size of the network, as a function of time, which for the past 70 years looks to be lying on something that looks like an exponential curve. It's not exponential curve. This is a misconception, because if you look at the vertical scale, it's logarithmic, which means it's an exponential scale of an exponential scale. If I was to plot it on the linear scale, I would have to stretch it to the linear scale, and that would have to be extremely tall. In fact, it had to be as tall as the distance between Earth and the Moon. You simply cannot draw it. So it's really a vertical wall we are dealing with. If I was to compare it to anything, I would say that it has to, chain reaction takes place in exponential rate. So this is like a chain reaction of chain reactions. That's the speed we are proceeding with. With that, I would like to thank you.